It was 6 minutes past 2 in the morning, and I was sitting at my kitchen table in my bathrobe, holding a letter that said my bank account had been compromised. The fourth catastrophe to arrive in my mailbox in 5 weeks. And I was reaching for the phone to call my son-in-law, the way I had reached for that phone through 3 years of catastrophes. Because Grant always knew what to do, Grant always fixed it. Grant was the only thing standing between me and a world that had apparently decided to come apart one envelope at a time. And then, while my other hand was still on the phone, my eyes did something they had done 100,000 times across 30 years of a career I thought I had retired from. Something so automatic I did not decide to do it any more than you decide to blink. They dropped to the bottom edge of the envelope, to the little row of tall and short bars printed under my address, and they read it. And somewhere in the back of my head, an old machine that had never once been turned off summed the digits, carried the remainder, and computed the check digit. And the check digit was wrong. I want you to understand what that means, because the entire rest of my life now divides into the years before that moment and everything since. In 30 years as a United States Postal Inspector, I examined more counterfeit mail than any man should have to see, sweepstakes fraud and phantom invoices and fake government notices by the boxful, and I will tell you the single truth that held across every last one of them. A counterfeit can fake a logo. It can fake a signature, a seal, a watermark, a tone of official menace polished to a shine. What a counterfeit almost never bothers to fake correctly is the boring part, the plumbing, the machine-facing marks that no frightened person ever looks at, because fear reads the headline and fear signs the check, and fear has never once in recorded history stopped to do arithmetic on a barcode. Real mail does not have to lie in the math. At 6 minutes past 2 in the morning in my bathrobe, at my own kitchen table, the math lied to me. Which meant the letter was not from mine. Which meant, though it would take me 11 more days to prove the whole shape of it, that the catastrophes had never been catastrophes at all. They were deliveries, 3 years of them, addressed to my fear with counterfeit postage by the one man in my life who kept showing up to save me from them. Before this story is over, you are going to see a corkboard in my dining room with 41 letters pinned to it in date order, and you are going to understand what each pin cost me. You are going to learn about a mail processing facility on the Maumee River that closed its doors in 2019, whose flag I personally watched come down, and how a dead building reached out of its grave to testify on my behalf. You are going to watch me invent a pension that never existed and mail it, so to speak, into one man's greed, and count the days until it came back to me wearing a disguise. And at the very end, you are going to sit at my kitchen table for the strangest dinner party in the history of Toledo, Ohio, and hear me ask my son-in-law to do one small thing, one tiny thing, the thing he had failed to do through 3 years and 41 letters. I asked him to read a barcode out loud and add it up for the table. Stay with me. Every envelope in this story gets opened before we are done. Before we begin, thank you for being here with me tonight. If this story means something to you, I would love to know where you are watching from. Put your city in the comments. I read every single one, usually in the morning, after I have walked out to a mailbox I am no longer afraid of, which is a sentence you will understand completely in about 90 minutes. And if stories like mine matter to you, please consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. A quick note before we start. Some names and details in this story have been changed to protect the people involved, but what happened, and what it nearly cost my family, is real. My name is Edwin Mercer. Everybody calls me Ed except my late wife, who called me Edwin when I was in trouble and Inspector when she was teasing, which averaged out to about half of our marriage each. I am 67 years old. I live in Toledo, Ohio, in the house on Chestnut Street where we raised our daughter. And for 30 years, until my retirement 7 years ago, I was a postal inspector, a federal agent of the United States Postal Inspection Service, which is a job most people do not know exists and which I will explain, because everything in this story runs through it the way everything in Toledo eventually runs through the river. People hear postal inspector and they picture a man checking whether the stamps are straight. Let me correct the picture. The Inspection Service is the oldest federal law enforcement agency in this country, older than the FBI by more than a century, and its business is every crime that touches the mail, which, if you think about it for 1 minute, is nearly every crime there is, because sooner or later, fraud writes something down and sends it to somebody. For 30 years, my working life was the anatomy of the lie in envelope form. I worked sweepstakes rings that emptied the savings of widows in 4 states. I worked phantom invoice mills that billed 10,000 small businesses for directory listings that did not exist. I worked fake charity drives, fake collection agencies, fake tax notices, fake banks, and one gentleman, I think of him often lately, who spent 6 years mailing retirees official-looking letters about problems he had invented, and then charging them gently, gratefully, to solve those problems. We called that one the rainmaker pattern in the office. First you sell the drought, then you sell the rain. 30 years of that work leaves a man with 2 laws burned in so deep they outlast the badge, and I am going to give them to you now up front, because this entire story is just those 2 laws coming home to my own kitchen table and finding me, of all people, asleep on watch. Law number 1. Fear is the fastest postage there is. A letter that frightens you travels from the mailbox to your heart without passing through your head. In 30 years, I interviewed hundreds of fraud victims, teachers and engineers, and at least 2 retired judges, sharp people, careful people, and every single one of them said some version of the same sentence. I know how it looks, but you don't understand. It seemed so urgent. Urgency is not a property of real problems, friends. Real problems mostly move slow and travel with paperwork. Urgency is a property of counterfeit ones. It is manufactured into them on purpose, because urgency is the solvent that dissolves verification, and verification is the only wall your money has. Law number 2, the one that saved my life at 2 in the morning. Every counterfeit is perfect exactly where you look, and cheap exactly where you don't. A forger spends his effort where the victim's eyes go, the logo, the letterhead, the threatening bold print. The machine-facing marks, the sorting barcode, the permit indicia, the facility codes, the processing sprays, the seam construction of the envelope itself. All the dull grammar of real mail moving through real machinery. That is where forgeries go cheap, because no one is watching. No one, that is, unless the addressee happens to be a man who spent 30 years being paid specifically to watch. My son-in-law, in the whole catalog of his cleverness, made exactly one mistake, and it was this one. He ran a 3-year counterfeit mail operation against the only house in the state of Ohio where the machine-facing marks had a full-time audience. He sold the drought and he sold the rain to a man who had spent his entire career arresting weathermen. Enjoy what happens. It took me a while to enjoy it. I enjoy it now. Now I have to tell you about June, and about how a chain letter gave me a marriage, because you cannot understand what was desecrated here without understanding what the mail meant in my house before a liar got hold of it. In 1981, I was a young inspector 2 years out of the academy, working complaints out of the Toledo domicile, and one of those complaints came from a church secretary on the east side who had reported, with magnificent indignation, a chain letter circulating through her congregation. The classic send $5 to the name at the top variety, and had not merely reported it but had traced it herself through 4 mailings, drawn a diagram, and interviewed on 3 of the participants. I drove out to take her statement expecting 10 minutes. I stayed 2 hours. The secretary's name was June Carmody. She was 26 years old. She had handwriting like a copperplate engraving and a diagram better than half the case agents I worked with. And when I finally rose to leave, she looked at my card, then at me, and said, "Inspector Mercer, if you people don't shut this thing down, I want you to know I intend to keep pulling the thread myself, and I don't imagine you'd enjoy being outworked by a church secretary." 14 months later. The chain letter ring, I will note for the record, was dismantled and the diagram that started it hung, framed in our hallway for 40 years, and it hangs there still. And when this story finally broke open, I stood in front of that diagram one night and told it out loud, "Well, Junie, I'm pulling the thread." June loved the mail. Not my job, the mail itself, the institution of it, the daily small sacrament of it. She wrote letters the way other people make phone calls. Real letters to her sister in Columbus, to college friends scattered across 3 time zones, to our daughter at summer camp sometimes, when I was traveling on a case, to me, timed so a letter in her copperplate hand would be waiting at my hotel when I checked in. She had a saying, and it is the doctrine this whole story eventually hangs from, so take it down. "A letter is a promise with a stamp on it," she used to say. Any coward can say a thing out loud and let the air take it away. Paper is testimony. When you write it and send it, you are telling the world you are willing to be held to it. 40 years I watched her live by that, and the mailbox at the end of our walk was, in our house, something close to a holy site. The place promises arrived. Hold that. Because a man was coming who would spend 3 years planting lies in that exact holy site. And part of what this story is about, underneath the money and the law, is what ought to happen to a man who counterfeits the sacrament of somebody's marriage. June died 4 years ago this spring. Pancreatic, fast, 10 weeks from the diagnosis to the end, and I will tell that part the way I have learned to, briefly, and with the one detail that matters. In her last week, when her hands had gotten unreliable, she dictated letters to me, 11 of them, one to each of the people she loved most, and made me promise to mail them from the blue collection box on Sycamore, not hand them over. Mail them because, she said, "Edwin, a letter handed over is just talking on paper. It has to travel to count." I mailed all 11 from the box on Sycamore on the morning after her funeral, and the walk back from that box was the longest of my life. And the mailbox at the end of our walk went, in one season, from the place promises arrived to the place almost nothing arrived at all, because the person our mail had mostly been for and from was gone. And then, 4 months after we buried her, my own chest tried to bury me. A triple bypass out of nearly nowhere, a Tuesday of crushing pressure and an ambulance, and then 6 weeks of recovery in a recliner, weak as wet paper, on blood thinners and strict orders, a widowed man alone in a big house with a zipper of staples down his sternum and a head full of fog they warn you about after the pump but which no warning prepares you for. I want you to see me clearly at that moment, because that is the man this scheme was built on. Grieving, weakened, terrified for the first time in my life of my own body, and drowning. This is the part people forget about widowhood, drowning in paperwork, because when a spouse dies, the mail turns hostile all on its own. Insurance, accounts, titles, her name to be removed from 100 registries, each envelope a small fresh cut. Into that house, into that recliner's field of vision, walked my son-in-law, Grant Keller, with a laptop bag over his shoulder and a rotisserie chicken in his hand. And he said the 11 words that opened the door to everything that followed. "Ed, you focus on healing. Let me handle the paperwork a while." I want to be fair to that moment, because fairness is the debt the teller owes, and because half of you watching have a grant of your own, and most of your grants are exactly what they appear to be, and God bless every one of them. It was a kind offer. It was, I believe, on that particular afternoon, even a sincere one. He set up the online banking I had never wanted. He switched my accounts to paperless to cut down the clutter, Ed. He built me an email address and filtered it, forwarded himself copies of everything important for backup, put his own cell number as the recovery contact on account after account. Because you're recovering, it should be somebody who's not on painkillers, which even made me laugh. My daughter Claire watched her husband spend his Saturdays untangling her broken father's affairs and loved him for it. And I watched it too from the recliner and felt, I will say it honestly, rescue. Within 2 months, every pipe that carried information into my life, the mail, the email, the accounts, the passwords, ran through one man's hands. And I signed off on all of it gratefully. A man who had spent 30 years teaching rooms full of trainees that access is the whole ball game because the fog was heavy and the grief was heavier, and he had brought a chicken. Let me tell you properly about Grant and Claire, because I promised myself at the start of this that nobody in it would be a cartoon, and I intend to keep the promise even where it costs me. Claire is 39, our only child, an ICU nurse at St. Vincent's, which means she is made of the particular alloy they use for people who can hold a stranger's hand at 4 in the morning and still chart accurately at 5. She has her mother's spine, and everyone says it, her mother's handwriting, which will matter in a small, devastating way near the end of this story. She met Grant 11 years ago, and I want to describe him the way he arrived, because he did not arrive as a villain, he arrived as a wonder. Grant Keller, 42 now, worked in information technology, systems and security for mid-size companies. A tall, easy, competent man with the specific gift of making complicated things sound simple and making the person he was helping feel smart rather than small, which, if you have ever been condescended to by a computer person, you will know is a gift about as common as an honest sweepstakes. And Grant fixed things. That was his whole language of love, visible. The dripping faucet, the router, the printer, my old truck's phone connection, Claire's schedule app, June's tablet, he fixed all of it, cheerfully, instantly, and the family word for him, coined by June herself, was the fire department, as in, don't fight with it, honey, call the fire department. I want that on the record. We built the role for him. We handed him the hydrant map of our whole family, years before he ever misused it, and he wore the helmet beautifully. I have had a long time now, and some professional help, to think about what was underneath the helmet, and I will give you the honest version rather than the satisfying one. Grant's father, I learned in the wreckage, had been the opposite of a fixer, a man who broke things, jobs, leases, promises, twice the family itself, and Grant had grown up as the 12-year-old who got the household bills into shoeboxes, who talked to the landlord, who managed the disasters a father kept manufacturing. The boy who saves the family becomes a man who needs a family to save. I do not offer that as an excuse. The court of this story convicts him all the same, but I offer it as the diagnosis, because you cannot protect your own house from a pattern you refuse to understand. Grant did not begin, I genuinely believe this, with theft in his heart. He began with a hunger to be needed that was older than any of us. And when the ordinary disasters ran out, when the faucets were all fixed and the routers all behaved, the hunger did what hunger does. And there was a second thing under the helmet, the thing with the dollar signs, and this one I did not learn until my old partner started pulling records. Grant had a company, a side venture, a software startup he had spun up with 2 partners about 5 years back. And it had failed, not loudly, worse, slowly. The kind of failure a proud man can hide inside, and it had failed with Grant's signature on a personal guarantee. And by the year the letters began arriving in my mailbox. My son-in-law, unknown to his wife, unknown to anyone at our Sunday table, was carrying a private debt north of $300,000. Compounding nightly, a drowning man in a dry shirt, passing the potatoes, complimenting the roast, and looking across the table at a foggy, grieving, grateful old widower whose entire information supply he now controlled. I want to pause the story here, the way I always pause, because you have the whole apparatus in front of you now, and you deserve to run the projection yourself before I confirm it. A retired inspector, recovering alone, every channel of his life routed through one man's hands. A son-in-law with a rescuer's hunger and a hidden $300,000 hole. A mailbox that used to bring letters from a wife and now brings almost nothing. Tell me in the comments what you think started arriving in that mailbox. And more to the point, tell me the mechanism. How you think a scheme like this actually sustains itself for 3 years without one slip. And then answer me the harder question, the one I will come back to at the end and ask you to grade yourself on. At what point exactly would you have caught it? Write down the moment. Be specific. I was a federal fraud investigator for 30 years, and my honest answer, which I will give you when we get there, still keeps me up some nights. The first disaster arrived about 5 months after my surgery, on a Tuesday, and I want to walk you through it beat by beat, because it was the template, and once you have seen the template you will recognize all 40 that followed, and more usefully, you will recognize the one that may someday arrive at your own mother's house. It was a letter, a good one. I will give the devil his due, from what appeared to be my bank's fraud prevention department. Urgent red banner, partial account number, correct, notifying me of suspicious activity and directing me to call a number within 24 hours to avoid a hold on my funds. And I did what the letter was engineered to make a man like the man I then was do. My chest went tight, my head went white, and I called, not the number on the letter, even in the fog some deep training held, I called Grant. And Grant, calm as morning, said the liturgy for the first time, the words I would hear with variations 40 more times over 3 years. Don't touch anything, Ed. Don't call that number. I'm coming over. And he came over and he sat at my kitchen table with his laptop, and he made calls and he typed, and after 90 minutes he leaned back and said, "Okay. Fixed. It was a phishing attempt, they never got in. I've locked everything down and hardened your passwords. You did exactly right calling me first. You did exactly right calling me first. Sit with the engineering of that sentence because it is load-bearing for 3 entire years." Every disaster came with its own solution, and every solution came with a lesson, and the lesson was always the same lesson wearing 40 coats. The world is on fire, Ed, and the fire department is me. I made tea, I remember, after that first one, and my hands were still not steady, and I remember one more detail from that afternoon that took me 3 years to understand, which is that Grant washed the cups. Stood at my sink at June's sink, sleeves up, washing 2 teacups a man in his 40s had every right to leave, and set them in the rack just so, and I remember thinking, watching him, what a thorough young man, he finishes things. He does finish things, friends. It is the most accurate observation I ever made about him. I simply had the object of the sentence wrong. And Grant put his hand on my shoulder and said, "This stuff is a jungle out here for guys your age." And I, Edwin Mercer, 30 years a federal inspector, 4 commendations, the man who broke the Rainmaker case, said, "And I want this in the record too, because the record is the point," I said. "Thank God for you, son. I truly don't know what I'd do, somewhere, in a filing cabinet in whatever office they keep the ledgers of irony. A clerk made an entry and closed the drawer. Now let me give you the 3 years, and I am going to give them to you the way I eventually reconstructed them, as a catalog, because the individual disasters do not matter. The rhythm is what matters. The rhythm is the whole crime, and I want you to feel it accumulate the way I felt it, one envelope at a time, until fear was simply the climate I lived in and Grant was simply the roof. There was the bank fraud alert, twice more, variations on the first. There was the letter from a collection agency I had never heard of, about a medical bill from June's final hospitalization, 4,000 and change, insurance error. Grant untangled it in a week of phone calls I was so grateful not to make myself. There was the county tax notice, a reassessment problem with the house, penalties accruing, Grant knows a guy, handled. There was the Medicare billing discrepancy. There was the homeowner's insurance letter threatening non-renewal over a roof inspection that had never happened, and Grant on the phone in my kitchen for an hour, magnificent, fighting for me. There was the letter about unclaimed property that turned out, Grant reported after investigating, to be a scam targeting seniors. Thank God you showed me first, Ed. That one deserves a medal if you think about it. A fake letter warning me about fake letters. The arsonist selling smoke detector. There was a data breach notification. There was a second collection agency. There was twice a year reliable as solstices, some trouble with the IRS, small at first, a notice of adjustment, a discrepancy in withholding, always caught and calmed by Grant before it grew. 41 letters in the final count across 3 years. And I want to tell you what 41 manufactured emergencies actually do to a man. Because the money, when we get to it, turns out. The larger theft was the world. Each disaster made the ground less trustworthy, and each rescue made the rescuer more essential. And the arithmetic of that, compounded over 3 years, rebuilt my entire personality from the studs. I stopped opening mail without my glasses and a knot in my stomach. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I let my poker night lapse, because half the table talk was finances and mine had become a source of shame, a thing always on fire, and a retired federal inspector cannot easily say out loud that he no longer understands his own accounts. I asked Grant before I bought a new water heater. I asked Grant before I renewed my truck insurance. I want to give you the full inventory of the shrinkage, because the granular losses are the crime nobody ever bills for. I stopped donating to the 2 charities June and I had supported for 30 years, because a letter had taught me that charity solicitations were how they find you, and Grant had agreed that pausing was wise. I let my subscription to the Blade lapse, the paper I had read at that kitchen table for 4 decades, because a renewal notice had arrived looking wrong to me. And by year 2 everything looked wrong to me. That was the whole point. A man under siege reads every envelope. I stopped driving to Cleveland for the retired inspector's lunch twice a year. 40 men who spoke my language, because the last time I went, someone asked how retirement was treating me, and I heard myself start to describe the fraud alerts and the tax scares. And I watched 2 old colleagues exchange a glance, half a second, the professional glance, the one we used to exchange across interview tables. And I understood they were running the pattern on me, So I simply stopped attending, and thereby removed from my own life the 40 people on earth most qualified to catch what was happening to me. That is not a side effect, friends. Isolating you from your own experts is the scheme working as designed. My daughter watched her father, a man who once ran multi-state fraud investigations, become a man who needed his son-in-law's blessing to change internet providers. And she drew the conclusion the evidence supported, because the evidence had been manufactured to support it. Dad is failing. Thank God for Grant. And here is the mechanism inside the mechanism, the part that took me longest to forgive myself for. So listen closely if you have an aging parent in your life. Grant did not merely send the fires and the fire truck. He curated the silence in between. With my email filtered through his rules and my accounts gone paperless into inboxes, he managed the real information of my life, the ordinary statements, the routine all is well of a solvent man's affairs, simply stopped reaching me. I never saw the quiet truth, only the loud lies. A man shown nothing but emergencies will conclude he lives in an emergency. The way a man shown nothing but bars will conclude he lives in a jail. And my jail had one visitor, and the visitor held the keys. and I thanked him at every visit. And my real mail, the boring, blessed, everything is fine mail, piled up, unread in digital rooms I did not know existed and could not have entered if I had. The worst harvest of those years, though, was not mine, and I want to be honest about it even though it is the hardest paragraph in this story to say out loud. It was Claire's. Because Grant, I learned much later, had been keeping his own file and its exhibits were me. Every panicked call I made him, logged. Screenshots of my frightened, fog-typed emails, Dad's forwarded messages. Look how confused, saved, and at strategic moments, shared gently with his wife, look, honey, I don't want to worry you, but my daughter was being shown a curated documentary of her father's decline, produced by the same studio that was scripting the decline, and it worked on her the way it would have worked on anyone, because she loved me. It was Claire, 2.5 years in, who sat at my kitchen table with a folder of brochures, glossy, kind photographs of card games and courtyard gardens, and said, with her mother's gentleness and tears standing in her eyes, Dad, we're not saying now. We're saying maybe it's time to think about somewhere with less to manage. Somewhere safe, somewhere safe. My daughter, whom I taught to ride a bicycle on the street, sat in June's kitchen and offered to help me escape my own life, and the man who had set every fire in it sat beside her, holding her hand, nodding, and said, whatever you decide, Ed, we're with you. And I looked at those brochures, and friends, here is the confession at the bottom of this section. I did not fight. I said I would think about it. Because by year 3 I was tired in a way I had no name for, and safe sounded like a real place, and the only person who seemed to know the road anywhere was Grant. That is what 41 letters buy. Not a signature, a surrender. The signature is just the receipt. If any of this rhythm is playing in a house you love right now, the emergencies that only one person can see, the rescues that only one person can perform, the slow currency exchange of fear into dependency, put the word climate in the comments. Not for me. For the next reader, so they can see how many houses this weather system visits. I read everyone, and the count, every time I tell a story like this, breaks my heart and steals it in the same scroll. And then, in the spring of year 3, the weather turned deliberate, because the drought had done its work, and it was finally time for Grant to sell the rain. It arrived, of course, as a letter, the most serious yet, from the Internal Revenue Service, or its evil paper twin, a formal notice of a substantial problem, back taxes and penalties tied to June's estate and my pension distributions, an amount with a comma in it, and language about liens, about property, about escalation, and this time Grant did not fix it in an afternoon. This time the fix arrived over 3 careful weeks, in stages like a real campaign, and I want you to watch the architecture assemble. First, a specialist, a tax resolution consultant Grant knew through work, a confident voice on speakerphone at my kitchen table who reviewed my situation and confirmed the danger and praised twice how lucky I was to have a son-in-law like this. Second, the strategy, delivered by Grant with a legal pad of diagrams. The exposure, Ed, is the assets sitting in your name. The retirement account, the house. We restructure, we consolidate into a managed account, I administer it, everything shielded, the specialist coordinates with the IRS, and this all goes away. And third, the clock. There is a response deadline on the notice, Ed, 12 days. I know it's fast, but we have to move $380,000 of retirement money into an account he administered. The house on Chestnut Street, June's house, appraised, discussed, sell before the lien lands, Ed, and a 12-day fuse burning on my kitchen table next to a legal pad in the handwriting of the fire department. I told him I needed a few days to get my head around it. He said, warmly, of course. And 4 nights later, at 6 minutes past 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, standing at the kitchen counter with the whole ugly stack of it. The IRS notice, the bank letters, 3 years of sirens. My eyes fell to the bottom edge of one envelope, to a little row of tall and short bars, and 30 years of muscle memory, the last unfiltered channel in my entire life. The one pipe Grant had never thought to cut because he did not know it existed. Woke up and did the... And the arithmetic said, this envelope has never seen the inside of a post office. You already know that moment. I gave it to you at the top. What I have not told you yet is what I did in the 60 seconds after it, because those 60 seconds are, I would argue, the whole difference between this story and the version where I lose everything. I did not wake anyone. I did not pace. I stood very still at my own counter, in the small cold clarity that comes when a career's worth of instinct finally gets a case it recognizes. And I heard my own voice from 100 trainings, in 100 rooms, saying the sentence I opened every fraud seminar with for 2 decades. When you find the first counterfeit, do not celebrate and do not panic. The first counterfeit is never alone. Go pull the file. I had a file. God help him, he never asked. 30 years an inspector, married 40 years to a woman who framed evidence diagrams for the hallway. I had every letter I had received since June died, all of it, filed by month in bankers' boxes in the basement, because you can retire a man from the inspection service, but you cannot make him throw away documents. It would be like asking him to throw away his own spine. I turned on the basement light. I carried up the boxes. I sharpened 2 pencils. And at 2:30 in the morning, at my kitchen table in my bathrobe, Inspector Edwin Mercer, retired, opened the last case of his career, in which the victim was the investigator and the crime scene was his own mailbox. And somewhere upstairs in a frame in the hallway, a church secretary's diagram looked down the stairwell and said, "About time, Edwin. Pull the thread." I worked until dawn, and I want to take you through what the file gave up, exam by exam, because this is the part of the story where 30 years of dull knowledge becomes a sword, and because every test I ran that night is a test you can run at your own kitchen table with no badge and no equipment beyond your eyes and a good lamp. And before this video ends, I am going to teach you all of them properly. I started with the barcode that had failed, and then I checked its brothers. Of the letters in my stack claiming to come from banks, agencies, insurers, the machine-printed barcodes on 11 of them failed the check digit outright. 11. A real barcode's digits are built to some clean. It is how the sorting machines catch their own errors, and a forger working from a graphics template types plausible-looking bars with no idea there is arithmetic underneath. The same way a man who forges a check writes a beautiful signature over a nonsense route. Perfect where you look, cheap where you don't, then the postmarks and facility codes, and this is where a dead building stood up to testify. 4 of the letters carried processing marks attributed to the Maumee River Processing and Distribution Center. Friends, I attended the decommissioning of the Maumee River facility in 2019. I stood on the asphalt with 200 other postal people in a cold wind and watched the flag come down and shook the plant manager's hand. And a facility that has been dark for years does not spray its designation on an envelope, unless the envelope was built by a man working from an old template he found online. A man who Googled what does a processed envelope look like some years back, saved an example, and reproduced its markings faithfully ever since. The way a counterfeiter photocopies a bill without knowing the series was recalled. My son-in-law had been mailing me letters from a ghost, and the ghost, I am pleased to report, was on my side. Then the physical stock. Real institutional mail is a product, machined by the 100 million window films and seam glues and paperweights bought by the ton, consistent as coinage. My counterfeits under the kitchen lamp ran heavier, brighter, the paper of a man buying good stock at an office supply store because good is how amateurs spell authentic, and the security tint inside the envelopes, that blue crosshatch you never once think about, repeated at the wrong interval. A pattern off a template again, perfect at a glance, cheap under a loop. And the folds. Machine-inserted mail is folded by rollers, crisp, dead center. Mine were folded by hands, a half-breath off-center, the same half-breath, letter after letter, year after year, the same hands. You can hide your face from a camera, son. You cannot hide your fold from an inspector. And then, with the light coming up gray over the backyard, I ran the last test, the one that turned a stack of forgeries into a portrait of a man. And I want you to remember it from the pastor story if you were here for that one, because it is the same eternal test wearing a mailbag. I took a fresh legal pad, and down the left side I wrote the private worries of 3 years, dated, as best my own pocket calendar and memory could fix them, the things I had said out loud, at Sunday dinners, on drives, to exactly one household. The week I mentioned the roof was aging. The month I wondered aloud whether June's hospital billing had ever fully settled. The dinner where I said the property taxes seemed high this year. The afternoon I mused about consolidating accounts to simplify things. And down the right side from the file, the letters, dated by arrival. Then I drew the lines. The insurance non-renewal about a roof inspection arrived 9 days after the roof comment. The collection letter about June's hospital arrived inside 2 weeks of the billing worry. The county tax notice 11 days after the tax remark. The consolidation pitch letters, the same season as my musing. 16 letters on the right. 16 lines, none longer than 3 weeks. My mail had been answering my dinner conversation for 3 years. Broadcasts do not answer friends. I have said it before in another man's story, and it held, and it holds here in mine. A thing that answers is a correspondence, and a correspondence has a correspondent, and I had passed the potatoes to mine every Sunday since my wife died. At the bottom of the pad, in the space where 30 years of habit puts the case designation, I wrote Mercer, E. Complainant and investigator, and under mechanism I wrote 4 words that I later heard my old partner read out loud with a low whistle, and they are the 4 words this whole scheme comes down to, so take them. He mailed me weather. By 7 in the morning I had the corkboard up in the dining room, June's corkboard, the one she used for her church rummage sales, and the letters went onto it in date order, and red yarn went from each letter to an index card with the matching dinner table worry. And when I finally stepped back and looked at 3 years of my own fear, pinned and strung and dated, I felt 2 things at once, and I will report them both honestly. The first was rage, the clean kind, and the second, stranger, and any investigator who has ever closed a long case will know it, was something adjacent to gratitude, because the worst season of my life had just resolved in one night from weather into crime. You cannot fight weather. Weather just happens to you. But crime, friends, crime has an author. Crime leaves marks. Crime can be worked. I had spent 3 years being rained on, and at 7 o'clock that morning, standing in front of that corkboard in my bathrobe with a pencil behind my ear, I stopped being a man caught in the rain and became, one last time, the Weather Bureau. I made coffee. I fried 2 eggs. I ate them looking at the board the way you look at a chessboard, and then I picked up the telephone, and I did not call my daughter, and I did not call a lawyer, not yet, and God knows I did not call. Vernon Ockhafer was my partner for 11 years. The best document man the Cleveland Division ever produced, a broad, unhurried man who examined paper the way other men play chess, 3 moves deep and no wasted motion, and who retired 2 years after I did to a house full of grandchildren and a garage full of woodworking he is genuinely terrible at. I called him at 8. I said, Vern, I need your eyes on some documents. He said, whose case? I said, mine. There was a pause with 11 years of partnership in it, and then Vern said, put the coffee on, and I want to tell you what that pause contained. because partnership is a currency this story spends heavily, and younger viewers should know the exchange rate. Vern and I had sat surveillance in cars that smelled of each other's terrible lunches through 400 cold hours. He had stood beside me at June's grave, and I at his brother's. In 11 years he had asked me for exactly one favor, a character letter for his nephew, and I had asked him for none, and we both understood in that pause that the account was finally being drawn on at 70+ years old at 8 in the morning with the word mine, and that whatever it was, he was already reaching for his shoes. If you have a Vern, you are wealthy. If you do not yet know whether you have one, the test is the pause. The right pause has no questions in it. And he was standing in front of my corkboard by 10:30 with his half-glasses on, and he went down the board letter by letter without one word for 40 minutes, which is Vern for absorbed. And when he finally straightened up, he took off the glasses and said the 2 sentences I had called him to hear, because I no longer fully trusted my own judgment and needed the second signature every good report carries. "Ed," he said. "First, this is the finest fraud file I have ever seen a victim assemble, and I am including the ones we built with subpoenas. Second, and look at me when I say this part, you understand this is federal. I understood. I need you, the audience, to understand it too, because it is the iron in everything that follows. Counterfeiting mail markings, mailing fictitious financial instruments, impersonating a federal agency, the IRS letter alone, transmitting fraudulent communications to obtain money. These are not family squabbles. They are the exact statutes I spent a career enforcing, the kind that arrive with sentencing guidelines, and both of us knew, standing at that corkboard, that the file in front of us was not a grievance. It was a case, a prosecutable one, against my daughter's husband, and every step I took from that morning forward would be taken on the narrow bridge between 2 ravines, the one where a predator walks away laughing, and the one where my grandchildrenless, husbandless daughter spends her 40s visiting a federal facility on alternate Sundays. Vern saw me looking into both ravines, and he did what a partner does. He poured more coffee and said, "So we work it clean and we decide." "That was always your rule, Mercer. Evidence first, verdicts later. Don't go soft on your own procedure just because the subject carves your turkey. We divided the labor the way we always had. Vern took paper, I took pattern. And for the digital plumbing, the email filters, the account settings, the whole invisible half of my captivity, we needed a third set of hands, younger ones. And I want to tell you about the call I made that afternoon, because it is one of my favorite parts of this whole affair. Marisol Vega was a trainee in the last academy class I ever taught, 26 years old then, sharp as a letter opener. And on the final day of my fraud documents block, I had shown the class the old party trick, reading a barcode's check digit at a glance, and Marisol had stayed after, made me teach her the method, and then practiced it at her desk for a month until she could beat me. She is 39 now, and she is a serving postal inspector out of the Cleveland Division, and when I reached her and said, "Inspector Vega, this is Ed Mercer, I have a situation," she listened to the outline in complete silence and then said, and I want her exact words preserved, "Inspector Mercer, are you calling me as my old instructor, or are you making a report? Because the first one, I'll come look tonight as a friend. The second one, I have to open a file, and files don't close because Thanksgiving gets awkward. That, friends, is a well-trained officer drawing the line for you before you cross it by accident, and I have never been prouder of a student." I told her the truth. I said tonight, "Come as a friend. But Marisol, bring a notebook and date your notes, because before this is over I may need the other version of you, and if I do, I intend for your file to be the easiest one you ever." She came that night. She looked at the corkboard for a long time, and then she said, quietly, the thing that reframed the entire investigation and set up everything you are about to watch. "Instructor, The letters are only half the machine. He couldn't run 3 years of fake emergencies unless he was also intercepting the real all clears. Somewhere in your email, in your accounts, there's a filter architecture, and filters, she smiled. And it was my own lecture smiling back at me across 13 years. Filters are documents too. They have timestamps. They have edit histories. Paper doesn't lie, and neither do logs. What Marisol pulled out of my accounts over the next 2 evenings, sitting at my kitchen table with my written authorization taped inside the cover of her notebook, was the invisible half of the corkboard, and I will give it to you the way she gave it to me, in her flat, devastating briefing voice. 47 filter rules, instructor. Anything from your real bank's actual domain, skip the inbox, forward to an external address, mark read. Same for the county. Same for Medicare, the insurer, the brokerage. Your genuine mail has been arriving for 3 years, and it has been detoured around you like traffic around a closed road. The external address the copies went to was created 8 days after your bypass surgery. And the recovery phone number on every single account, the number any real institution would call to warn you, has been his cell since the month you came home from the hospital. You were never confused, instructor. She let that sit, and then she added the finding that put the last nail in the architecture. The filter's edit log shows activity spikes, she said, checking her notebook, clusters of changes, and I've matched the dates. Every cluster lands within 72 hours of one of the index cards on your board. He didn't build the cage once, instructor. He has been tightening it in response to your dinner conversation for 3 years. Your Sunday roast has an edit history. Your Sunday roast has an edit history. I wrote that sentence in my case notes, and under it I wrote the status line that ended phase 1. And if you have been with this channel for the other stories, you know the weight it carries. Mechanism established. Authorship next. Because everything on that corkboard and in those logs pointed at Grant the way iron filings point at a magnet. But pointing is not proof. A defense attorney lives in the gap between pattern and pen. And there was one man's counsel echoing in my head from a locksmith story I had heard somewhere. Or perhaps we all just learn it eventually, the hard way in our own trades. When you find out your lock's been picked, you don't call the burglar. You seat a lock, you watch the door, and you count what opens. It was time to go fishing in my own mailbox. It was time for the pension that never existed. But first, the vote, because this is the hinge of the whole affair, and I want your honest answer on the record before you see mine play out. I am standing in my dining room with a corkboard that would make a federal prosecutor cancel his golf. My old partner has authenticated it. A serving inspector has mapped the digital. The 12-day clock on the fake IRS deadline is at 7 days and burning. I have a daughter who believes her husband hung the moon and her father is losing his grip, and I have a son-in-law who, the moment he smells smoke, can shred, delete, and lawyer up by lunch. So, do I go to Claire now, board and all, and trust my daughter's eyes? Do I go federal now, hand Marisol the file, and let the statutes do what statutes do? Or do I keep the cage looking locked, let him keep tightening it, and spend my last 7 days building the one thing the file still lacks, proof of the hand itself? One word in the comments, daughter, federal, or fish. And I will tell you that Vern voted daughter, and Marisol, bless her regulation heart, voted federal, and I overruled them both, with the only sentence that outranks a partner and a protégé at the same time. Gentlemen, I said, which was rude to Marisol, and she let it go. I spent 30 years telling juries that pattern plus opportunity is a theory, and theory acquits. We fish. The pension that never existed was born the following afternoon, at my kitchen table, over pie. And I built the lie the way Vern. And I used to build test letters for mail cover operations. Every surface load-bearing, and I want to walk you through the engineering, because the craft is the point, and because somewhere out there a family is going to need this exact template. I told Grant, and only Grant, Claire was on shift, no one else on earth heard it, that I had gotten a phone call. A phone call note, not a letter. Nothing he could ask to see, from a benefits administrator winding down the old pension plan of Lakeshore Tool and Die, a company I genuinely did work summers for in the 1970s. A fact checkable in my actual history, which is what you anchor a lie to. The administrator, I said, had found me listed with a small vested balance from those old summers, grown over 50 years to $52,000, and there were forms coming, and I would need to decide where to have it deposited. And honestly, Grant, I said, reaching for a second slice, I was thinking, simplest thing might be to just have it go into my regular checking and figure it out from there. And then I hooked the barb in. But don't mention it to Claire yet. If it's real, I'd like to surprise her with something from it. Her mother always wanted her to have a real piano. Study the load points with me. The sum was specific and modest, believable, worth taking, not worth suspecting. The provenance was anchored to true history. The channel was a phone call, unverifiable, undeniable. The secrecy was requested by me, which meant his silence toward Claire would feel loyal instead of guilty. And the destination, my ordinary checking account, was the trap's tripwire, because $52,000 landing in an account Grant did not administer was a problem for exactly one person in Ohio. A leak in a dam only its builder knew existed, and dam builders, when they hear dripping, do not send sympathy. They send concrete. If Grant was innocent, nothing would happen. A phantom pension would simply never materialize and die quietly the way phantoms do. If Grant was the author, then somewhere in the next week, my mailbox would produce paper, official, urgent, helpful paper, steering 52,000 imaginary dollars away from my checking and toward the managed account. And the day that paper arrived, the pattern would have a pen. Then we set the watch on the door itself, and this part I owe to my neighbor Bud Zawicki, 71, retired from 35 years at the Jeep plant and the most decorated deer hunter in 3 counties, a man whose garage contains, among much else, 4 trail cameras of the kind that photograph anything warm that moves in front of them and stamp it with the date and time. I told Bud the whole story over his workbench, because you cannot borrow a man's trail cameras for a job like this on false pretenses. And Bud listened, motionless to all of it. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, in pure Toledo, Ed, I've waved at that son of a gun at your barbecues. And then he took 2 cameras off the pegboard and said, one for the box, one for the street, and I want it known that when this was over. Bud Zawicki declined a bottle of good bourbon and requested instead to be present at the end, and you will hear, when we get there, exactly how I honored that request, because Bud earned it. The cameras went up that evening, one in the lilac hedge with a clean view of my mailbox, one in Bud's front window covering the street, and Marisol, notebook dated, photographed the installation. And Vern drove my sealed written account of the entire trap, the phantom pension, the exact figure, the piano detail, every word, to the office of an attorney named Adele Fontaine, an estates and elder law lawyer with a reputation for cheerful ferocity, who read the summary, looked at me over her glasses and said, Mr. Mercer, in 20 years of elder financial abuse cases, I have never had a client arrive with a notarized trap, a chain of custody, and his own corkboard. And I said, ma'am, my late wife framed evidence for our hallway. We are a particular kind of family. And Adele Fontaine wrote the date across the seal and put it in her safe and said, then let's go be particular at somebody. The letter took 5 days. 5 days, and on the morning of the 5th, Bud's hedge camera earned its place in this story's Hall of Fame. At 6:11 a.m., 40 minutes before sunrise and 3 hours before our carrier ever reaches Chestnut Street, A gray sedan I have parked behind at every family gathering for 11 years rolled to a stop at my curb with its headlights off. And the camera, patient as only machines in Vern are patient, took 9 photographs of my son-in-law, in a hooded sweatshirt leaving his engine running, walking around the front of his car, opening the mailbox my wife painted, placing an envelope inside, closing the little door with, and this detail I will carry to my grave with care gently, the way you close a door in a sleeping house and driving away. Time-stamped. Sequential. His face clear in 3 frames. My mailbox, June's mailbox, the holy site where 40 years of promises had arrived, and a man in a hood feeding it a lie by hand in the dark, and I sat at Bud's workbench at noon looking at those 9 photographs, and Bud looked with me, and after a while he said the only eulogy the moment needed. He didn't even use a stamp, Ed. Cheap, he said, everywhere you weren't looking. Even at the mailbox. Especially at the mailbox. The envelope itself was, I will grant the craftsman this, his masterpiece. Lakeshore Tool and Die Legacy Benefits Administration. A letterhead built from nothing, because the real plan's records would have shown no such administrator. A barcode, wrong, naturally. I checked it standing at the box with gloves on like the old days. And inside, 2 pages of warm bureaucratic prose congratulating me on my located benefit of $52,000 and advising, for tax efficiency and estate protection, against deposit into an individual, recommending instead direct rollover into a qualified managed structure, and providing, helpfully, the routing details of the very account Grant administered and a form and a deadline. He had taken my phantom, dressed it, and mailed it back to me with a leash on it. The fish had not merely bitten the hook. The fish had swallowed the boat. I stood at my kitchen table with that letter in my gloved hands, the corkboard behind me, the photographs in a folder, 3 years of weather finally holding its author's fingerprints, and I said out loud, to the empty kitchen, to the diagram in the hallway, to a church secretary who had once promised a young inspector she would keep pulling the thread herself, all right, Junie. Threads pulled. Now we plan the dinner. Before the dinner, the housekeeping, because a case is not the arrest. A case is everything you quietly nail down first so the arrest cannot wriggle. Those last 5 days ran like the closing week of an old task force, and Adele Fontaine ran the board. First, the money, because you protect the vault before you announce the robbery. The fake IRS deadline, with its push toward the $380,000 consolidation. I answered with silence, letting Grant believe the old man was simply slow, while Adele and I spent a morning at my actual bank and my actual brokerage, in person, with identification, resetting every credential, removing his recovery numbers, revoking a limited financial authorization I had signed in the fog of year 1 and barely remembered, and flagging both. Then the real IRS, and I want every viewer to hear this part because it took 11 minutes. 11 minutes on the official phone number printed on my prior year's actual tax transcript, not any number from any letter, to confirm what 3 years of terror had been built on. Mr. Mercer, the woman said, I show no notices, no balance due, and no flags on your account at all. Have a nice day. 3 years, friends. 3 years of my life, dissolved by one phone call I could have made on day 1, to a number I already possessed, and I sat in the car outside afterward and did not turn the key for a while, because there is a particular grief in learning the cage door was never locked. It was only painted, and I will return to that grief in the lessons, because it is the most useful thing I own now. Second, the record. Marisol, notebook current, took formal custody photographs of the corkboard, the letters, the filter logs, the camera cards, and sat with me while I wrote out the master affidavit, 31 pages, every date, every exhibit lettered. And when it was signed and notarized in Adele's office, Marisol looked at the stack and said, quietly, Instructor. I want you to know that if you say the word, this walks into my office tomorrow as the cleanest referral of my career. And the United States Attorney will send you a fruit basket. And I said, I know, Inspector. Hold that thought about 9 more days. The word may yet get said. It depends entirely on a conversation I have to have at a dinner table. And third, Claire, I have to account for this choice because it is the one I get challenged on every time. I did not show my daughter the file before the dinner. Vern argued for it to the last, and Vern was arguing for mercy, for sparing her the ambush. But I had watched for 3 years what curated information does, how the first mover in a war of stories owns the ground, and I knew that if Claire got the file privately, she would do the human thing, the loving thing, the fatal thing. She would go to her husband and give him a night to weep, explain, reframe, and by morning I would be facing not a cornered forger but a rehearsed couple. My daughter deserved the truth, all of it, but she deserved it the way a jury deserves it, with the exhibits on the table and the defendant's face in view and no one, curating her feed ever again, not even me. So I called her and said, "Sweetheart, Sunday dinner at my place, I'm cooking. Tell Grant I've decided about the IRS thing and the consolidation, and I want to go over the paperwork with you both." And Claire, relieved, said, "Dad, that's wonderful, honestly, it'll be such a weight off everyone," and hung up happy. And I stood with the phone in my hand feeling like precisely what I was, a man baiting a hook with his own daughter's relief. And I have made peace with it mostly because the alternative was leaving her in the aquarium. And no, that phrase is not mine, it belongs to a boy in another family story. But we retired investigators trade our parables, and that one is true. Sunday, pot roast, June's recipe because some occasions you cater from the archive. Claire brought rolls. Grant brought, and you may laugh, I did internally a bottle of wine and a folder, his folder, the consolidation paperwork, flagged with signature tabs, the little arrows pointing where the old man should sign, and he set it by his plate the way a hunter leans his rifle by the door, and complimented the roast twice, and was funny and warm, and helped Claire with her chair. And I watched him across my table with the strangest feeling of the entire affair, which I will confess to you because these stories are worthless without the confessions. Some part of me, even then, even holding what I held, wanted him to be who he was pretending to be. That is the last power these men have over us, the mourning of the person they impersonated, and you do not fully cancel it. You just proceed over it. We proceeded over pie. I cleared the plates, poured the coffee, and said, "Grant, before we do your folder, I've got a little paperwork of my own, humor an old man," and I stood. And I opened the double doors to the dining room, where the corkboard stood waiting under the good chandelier. 41 letters, 16 index cards, the red yarn, the filter logs printed and pinned. The 9 photographs from Bud's camera enlarged along the bottom row, and the phantom pension letter, his masterpiece, framed dead center like the ribbon winner at a county fair. I have run a fair number of interrogations, and I have testified in rooms where verdicts landed, and I have never in my life heard a silence like the one that stood in my dining room for those first 10 seconds. Claire looked at the board the way you look at weather on the horizon, not yet understanding it is coming for you. And Grant looked at the bottom row, at 9 photographs of himself in a hood at a mailbox in the dark, and I watched 3 years of architecture leave a man's face in a single breath. And what remained was so much smaller than what had been there that Claire, seeing it, made a sound, before she understood anything, purely at the sight of her husband's face becoming the face of a stranger. I did not raise my voice. I gave the briefing exhibit by exhibit, the way I gave 1,000 of them, dates, documents, the check digits, the ghost facility, the 16 red threads from her father's dinner table worries to the letters that answered them, the 47 filters, the recovery numbers, the 6:11 a.m. Timestamps and my daughter, an ICU nurse, a woman trained to stand upright inside catastrophe, stood through all of it with her hand pressed flat against her sternum. And the only thing she said, the whole time, she said at the filter logs, very quietly to no one. That's why the bank never called him. I wondered for 2 years why the bank never called him. And then I came to the end of the board, and I turned to my son-in-law, and I did the thing I had rehearsed at Bud's workbench until Bud declared it, and I quote a Jeep man of 35 years, better than any deer he'd ever dropped. I took the phantom pension letter down from its frame, and I set it on the table in front of Grant, next to his folder with the little signature arrows. And I said, son, before anybody says one word about all this, I want you to do one tiny thing. And I put my finger on the row of tall and short bars along the bottom edge, and I said, read me that barcode, out loud, digit by digit, and then add it up for the table and tell us all whether it checks. He looked at the bars. He looked at me. And in his face I watched the last, worst discovery of his 3-year career arrive, the discovery every counterfeiter in every case I ever closed eventually made, always too late, always in a room like this. The discovery that the boring part was the whole part, that the machinery he faked had grammar, and the grammar had arithmetic, and the arithmetic had, this whole time, an audience of 1. 30 years, Grant, I said gently, because gently was the plan, and by God, gently was harder than shouting. 30 years I got paid to check the math on frightened people's mail. You mailed a fraud investigator 41 frauds, and you never once checked whether the math was watching. His mouth moved. Nothing came out that mattered. And it was Claire, my daughter, June's daughter, who reached past him, picked up the letter, looked at the bars her father had been reading since before she was born, and said, in a voice I had last heard from her mother across a church office in 1981, flat and final as a postmark, it doesn't check, does it, Grant? Nothing about you checks. What came out of Grant Keller over the following 2 hours, once the architecture was gone and there was nothing left to hold the wall up, I am going to report fairly and at length, the confession and the anatomy both, because I promised no cartoons, and because the anatomy is what the families watching actually need. If you came for the collapse, you have had it. Stay for the autopsy. The lesson's live there. It began, he said, and the file supports him with the startup. The failure he could not say out loud, the personal guarantee, the debt that renamed itself every 18 months at worst terms, $310,000 by the year of my bypass, serviced in secret out of a paycheck his wife believed was building their future. And into that pressure came my catastrophe, June, then my heart. And Grant did what he had done since he was 12 years old in a house full of his father's wreckage. He managed the disaster. And here is the first hard truth of the autopsy, the one I make myself say plainly. The first months were real. The chicken was real. The paperwork help was real. The man has a genuine gift for rescue. It is the truest thing in him, and the scheme grew out of the gift the way rot grows out of ripeness. Because the rescues felt, he said, and he said it staring at the table like the only hours of his life that worked. Everywhere else I was drowning, Ed. In your kitchen. And when I got you squared away, when the real problems ran out, and this is the sentence I have thought about most, when the real problems ran out, I panicked. When the real problems ran out, I panicked. There is the whole disease in 7 words, friends. The rescuer who cannot survive the rescue's success. The first counterfeit letter, he swore, and the dates on my corkboard actually bear this out, predated any theft by months. It was not built to steal. It was built to be needed, one more fire for the department, and it worked so well. I was so grateful, so warm, so restored to him that he built another. The money came later, the way money always comes later, through the door habit had already propped. A management fee here, a skim of a reimbursement there. $46,000, the final accounting found, siphoned in threads across 3 years. Every thread paid in his mind toward the debt, toward the day he would be clear and could stop. because they always believe they will stop. It is the license they issue themselves nightly. And then the debt's refinancing collapsed last spring, and the threads were no longer enough. And that is when the weather turned deliberate, the fake IRS, the 12-day fuse. The push for the whole vault in the house. I asked him at one point the question Claire could not, whether the assisted living brochures, the curated evidence of my decline shown to his own wife, had been part of the plan from the start. And he said no, and then he stopped, and then he gave the most honest answer of the night, which was, "I don't know anymore, Ed. That's the part I can't explain to you." After a while I couldn't tell which fires I was setting and which ones I just wasn't putting out. "My father was a disaster," he said finally, "and I built my whole self out of not being him, and I turned into something with better paperwork." Claire left the room during that stretch once and came back with her coat on, and did not put it on the chair. She wore it, seated, for the rest of the night. And if you want to know what the end of a marriage looks like, it is not shouting. It is a woman in her father's dining room wearing her coat indoors at 9 p.m., asking her husband forensic questions in her charting voice. It was Claire who asked about the 6:11 a.m. photographs how many times, and Grant said he honestly did not know, and Claire said, estimate, the way she must say it to interns about blood loss. And he said over 3 years, maybe 30, and my daughter looked at the mailbox photographs, her mother's mailbox, and said quietly, "You watched us paint that box. You held the ladder." And Grant Keller put his face in his hands, and that particular exhibit needed no yarn. Now the verdict and the accounting, because you have stood with me this long and you get the full ledger, the federal question. You voted on it, daughter, federal, or fish, and you have seen what fishing bought. Here is how the last vote went. Marisol laid it out for the family in Adele's office that Wednesday with the clean brutality of the well-trained. The referral, she said, was righteous and ready: mail fraud, counterfeit postal markings, false federal agency communications, and conviction was, in her professional judgment, close to certain. And then my daughter, whom the statutes existed to protect, said the sentence that decided it. "I have lost the marriage either way," Claire said. "The question on the table is only whether I also lose the next 10 Christmases to a visiting room, and whether Dad spends his 80s as a witness for the prosecution instead of a grandfather. So I choose the version with teeth and without bars, if a version with teeth exists. Show me the teeth." Adele Fontaine showed her the teeth, and I will list them, because families in this situation deserve the template. A full written confession, sworn, notarized, every letter, every date, every dollar, executed in Adele's office and lodged in her safe beside my trap statement and the camera cards. Restitution of the $46,000, secured against Grant's vehicle and his retirement account, on a schedule with no mercy in it. Every access revoked, every password, every proxy, confirmed in writing by each institution. The consolidation folder with its little signature arrows, shredded in front of me by its author, at my request, in my kitchen. And yes, that request was petty, and no, I do not regret it. A man is allowed one petty thing per betrayal, and that was mine. And the tooth that matters most, the one I insisted on and Marisol constructed. The entire file, affidavit, exhibits, photographs, confession, sits copied in a sealed package in Inspector Viga's custody, and the terms which Grant signed are these. If one more counterfeit communication of any kind aimed at any person ever traces to Grant Keller, the seal comes off and the package walks into the United States Attorney's office the same afternoon, with 3 years of interest. He does not get probation from a judge. He gets it from me, and my parole board is a cork board, and it meets in my dining room forever. Vern called it the finest sentence never handed down in the Northern District of Ohio. Bud called it something better, but Bud's version is not for broadcast, and the last accounting of that Wednesday was between Grant and me alone, on Adele's 14th floor landing, waiting for the elevator, when he finally asked me the question the whole affair had been circling. "Why dinner, Ed? You had the file. You could have just had them come for me. Why the pot roast? Why the board? Why make me read the numbers out loud?" And I gave him the true answer, and I give it to you now, because it is as close to a philosophy as this old inspector owns. "Because arrests punish, son," I said, "but they don't teach, and you are going to be in my family's orbit at some distance for the rest of my life, and I needed you taught. You spent 3 years making the people who trusted you feel stupid at their own kitchen tables. So the lesson had to happen at a kitchen table, and the lesson is this. The boring parts of the world are load-bearing, the dull marks, the check digits, the filed letters, the people you wave at over barbecues. You built your whole scheme on the certainty that nobody was watching the boring parts, and son, the boring parts are all anybody like me has ever watched." The elevator came. He held the door. Old habit, the fire department to the last, and I stepped in, and we rode down without another word, which was, I believe, the first fully honest conversation we ever had. Now the year after, honestly rendered, the repair and the residue both, because these stories owe their audiences the unglamorous part or they owe them nothing. Claire filed for separation that same month and moved, for a season, into her old bedroom down the hall from mine, 39 years old, an ICU nurse sleeping under a ceiling still faintly marked with the glow stars her mother put up in 1993. And I will tell you that having her home, under those circumstances, was a grief and a gift so tangled together that I gave up sorting them and just cooked for her. We did not talk about Grant most nights. We talked about her patience, and my corkboard came down that first week. She asked me to take it down. I understood, and the dining room went back to being a dining room, though the file lives on in Adele's safe and Marisol's seal, and the trail cameras went back to Bud's pegboard with full honors. What Claire and I did talk about, eventually in the slow, sideways manner of careful people, was the fog years, and I owe you the hardest exchange of them because it is the one the adult children watching need. She asked me, one February night over decaf, why I never once called her when the letters came. 3 years, Dad, she said. 41 disasters, and you called him every time and me never. Did you think I couldn't handle it? And I told her the truth I had excavated by then with some professional help, which is that it was never doubt of her, it was vanity of me. A father wants to arrive at his daughter's door as the lighthouse, never as the wreck, I said, and Grant understood that about me before I understood it about myself, and he built the whole scheme inside my vanity, the way a shipworm builds inside a hull. The lesson, Claire, and I made her look at me for this part, the lesson is that the people who love you cannot verify what you hide to look strong for them. Weakness shown early is information. Weakness hidden is inventory, and somebody will eventually count it and sell it. She cried a little, my unflappable girl, and then she said in her mother's exact cadence, "Well, new rule in this family. We arrive as wrecks. And we have, both of us, since, and I commend the rule to every proud family watching. Arrive as wrecks. It is cheaper. Grant pays on schedule every month and works and lives across town and sees a therapist whose specialty, Claire tells me, is exactly the pattern I diagnosed at the dinner table, the rescuer who manufactures the need. Whether the marriage survives is not settled as I record this. They sit in a counselor's office twice a month, and I have declined, firmly, every invitation from every relative to hold an opinion about it, because I have learned where opinions travel in a family and what they compound into. What I hold instead is the seal, and the schedule, and a civil, careful peace with a man who, I will report one small strange thing, shovels my walk when it snows early before I wake and does not mention it, And the first time I caught the shoveled walk from my window, I stood there a long moment, deciding what it was, penance or reflex or courtship of my forgiveness. And then I decided it did not require classification, and put it in the file under boring parts. Load. And the mail came back. I want to tell this properly because it is the actual ending. Everything after it is just lessons. With the filters torn out and the accounts reclaimed, my mailbox, June's mailbox, began over weeks to fill again with the ordinary truth of a solvent man's life. Statements that reconciled, a county that wanted nothing, an insurer renewing without drama, and I stood at that box some mornings reading an ordinary bank statement like it was correspondence from a liberated country, which it was. But the part I need you to hear is what Claire did. My daughter, the month she moved back in, bought a box of note cards and started a habit, and she keeps it still from her own apartment now, of mailing me one card a week, real mail, a stamp, 3 or 4 lines in handwriting that is her mother's handwriting continued by other means. Saw a cardinal on the unit windowsill, thought of you, roast on Sunday, love C. The first one arrived on a Tuesday, and I stood at the box with it, and I am not ashamed to tell you what I did, because June would have demanded a full report. I read it twice, and I checked the barcode, out of love, out of habit, out of ceremony, and it summed clean, of course it did. And I said out loud to the box her mother painted, to the street, to the whole restored republic of the ordinary, it checks. And every Tuesday since, some part of my week is a walk to that box to verify, in both senses, both sacred senses, that a promise with a stamp on it still travels and still counts and still checks. Bud got his request, by the way, and I promised you I would tell it. Bud Zawicki's condition for the loan of his cameras was to be present at the end, and the end, as Bud defined it, was not the dinner. Bud has manners. The end was the morning, a week after everything settled, when I took down the mailbox, June's mailbox, dented now with 3 years of history I did not want to look at daily, and Bud and I, 2 old men and a level and a bag of quickset concrete, planted a new post and mounted a new box, and painted it badly, the same blue June chose in 1986. And when it was done, Bud straightened up, surveyed our work, and delivered the benediction he had been fresh box, clean math, and a camera in my window forever because I'm nosy now. Ed, you've ruined me. Any gray sedan slows down on this street again, I'll have it framed by lunch. If you have a Bud on your street, and most streets have one, waving distance from your whole life, I want you to consider tonight that your neighborhood already contains a surveillance network of the retired and the observant that no technology company can match, and it runs on coffee and being asked. Now let me pay my debts to the comments because I keep my books, and then I am going to teach you the checks, all of them, the full seminar, because that is the actual reason I sat down in front of this microphone, and everything else was just the tuition. First debt. Early on, I asked you to write down the exact moment you believe you would have caught it, and I promised you my own answer, the one that keeps me up some nights. Here it is, itemized, because I audited myself the way I would audit anyone. Across 3 years there were, by my count, 9 separate moments when the evidence in my own hands was sufficient for the man I used to be. The letter that misspelled the county's name. The collection notice that arrived on a Sunday, and mail does not come on Sunday, friends. It was in the box Monday morning but dated received Sunday in my own log, and I logged it and did not see it. The fraud alert with a callback number 1 digit different from my bank's real number printed on the card in my own wallet, 8 inches from the letter. 9 tripwires, and I stepped over everyone, and here is the finding of the audit, and I want it framed in every comment section on this channel. I was not fooled because I was old, and I was not fooled because I was foolish. I was fooled because I was flooded. Fear does not defeat expertise by outsmarting it. Fear defeats expertise by exhausting it. 41 emergencies is not a puzzle, it is a siege, And the purpose of a siege is never to breach the wall. It is to make the man on the wall too tired to look down at the arithmetic he has known his whole life. So when you graded yourself in the comments, and most of you graded yourselves early catchers, I believed you about the first letter. Now tell me honestly about the 31st, arriving in month 26 on a morning when you are tired and grieving, and the last 40 solutions all came from the same warm voice. The scheme that gets you will not beat your mind. It will book your mind solid and then deal with your heart directly. Guard accordingly. Second debt, the vote, daughter, federal or fish, and the accounting of my override. Fishing bought the photographs, and the photographs bought everything. The confession, the restitution, the seal, my daughter's freedom to choose teeth without bars. And I stand by the override, but I owe you the cost line too, because command decisions always have one. The cost was 11 more days of my daughter married to a lie with my knowledge, 11 days of her chattering happily to me on the phone about the weight coming off everyone, while I held the file and said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart." I do not fully have absolution for those 11 days and I have stopped applying for it. If you are ever the one holding the file, know the price going in. Evidence first, verdicts later is the right procedure, and the right procedure will cost you something no procedure can reimburse. Pay it anyway. The alternative rates are worse. And now, the seminar. The Mercer checks, June's rules. 30 years of the inspection service boiled down to what fits on a card by the telephone. And I want you to hear these not as trivia but as armor. And I want you to teach them to somebody older than you within the week, at a kitchen table, with the television off. Check 1, the callback rule, and if you keep only one, keep this. Never, ever respond to an alarming communication using any contact information printed on the alarming communication. Not the phone number, not the website, not the envelope, not the helpful QR square. The letter chooses what it says. It also chooses where it sends you, and a counterfeit letter is a counterfeit door, opening into the forger's own hallway. You call your bank at the number on the back of the card that has lived in your wallet for years. You call the IRS at the number on last year's transcript. You walk into the branch. 11 minutes, friends. 11 minutes on a number I already owned dissolved 3 years of siege. The real institution is always reachable by the road you already knew. The counterfeit lives only at the address it hands you. Check 2, the urgency test. Real institutional trouble moves like an institution, slowly in duplicate, with appeal periods measured in months. Deadlines of days, threats of hours act before the window closes. These are not the grammar of government or banking. They are the grammar of theater because urgency exists to outrun your verification. And the moment a letter tells you there is no time to check, it has told you the single most important fact about itself, which is that it cannot survive checking. Check 3, the secrecy test, urgency's twin. Any communication, any advisor, any process that asks you not to discuss it with family, with your own lawyer, with the branch teller has confessed. Legitimate business survives witnesses. Fraud is allergic to the second opinion the way counterfeits are allergic to arithmetic, and the request for quiet is the loudest thing a scheme ever says. Check 4, the specimen drawer. This one is pure inspection service and it costs nothing. Keep one folder, a real folder paper of known genuine letters, one from your actual bank, your actual insurer, your actual county, verified once by calling the number you already had. That folder is your reference library. When a new letter arrives shouting, you do not need my 30 years, you need side by side. Hold the newcomer against the specimen. The logo will match, forgers are good at logos, look at everything else. The paper's weight, the fold, the window. The little dull machine markings along the bottom. Perfect where you look, cheap where you don't, so look where you don't. Differences between the shouting letter and the quiet specimen are the whole conversation. Check 5, the pattern ledger, and this is June's, and it is the deepest one. Write your days down. Who called, what arrived, what worried you, and when. Because no single counterfeit announces itself, but patterns cannot help it, whether that answers your private conversation. Emergencies that cluster around one helper's availability. Disasters that only ever have one witness and one solution. A simple dated log kept faithfully is a machine for making the invisible rhythm visible, and it is the one investigative tool that has featured in every single one of these stories I have ever heard or lived. The ledger, the log, the diary, the file, because the counterfeit's one unfixable flaw in mail, in sermons, in sons-in-law, is that it must keep arriving, and anything that keeps arriving keeps a schedule, and schedules, friends, some. Like barcodes. Run the math. There are 2 loose threads I owe you before the ending, because I saw both of them in the comments the last time I told a story with this shape, and an inspector who leaves threads deserves the comments he gets. The first is the tax resolution specialist, the confident voice on my speakerphone who confirmed the danger and praised my luck in having such a son-in-law. You want to know who he was, and the answer, when Marisol pulled the thread, turned out to be the cheapest trick in the whole affair and the most instructive. The specialist's number was an internet phone line, a voice-over IP account, registered, Marisol found in about 9 minutes, to an email address 1 letter removed from Grant's own, and the voice was Grant, running a consumer voice-changing application and a script, sitting in his parked car 2 blocks from my house so the call would not share his home network, playing both halves of my rescue like a man doing a puppet show with each hand. When it came out at the dinner table, Claire asked him only one question about it, which was whether he had written the specialist's compliments about himself, and Grant said yes, and my daughter laughed once, a terrible bark of a laugh, and said, well, at least somebody in this marriage was getting praised, and friends, I have heard cross-examinations that drew less blood. The lesson of the specialist is the lesson of the age, and I will put it plainly for everyone my vintage. A voice is no longer a person. A confident stranger endorsing the plan by phone is a graphic, the audio equivalent of a letterhead, and it verifies exactly nothing. The road you already knew. Always only the road you already knew. The second thread is heavier, and I have saved it deliberately because it belongs near the end. You will remember the 11 letters, the ones June dictated in her last week and made me mail from the blue box on Sycamore, 1 to each of the. What I did not tell you, because I had honestly not counted the recipients in years, is that one of the 11 was addressed to Grant. I learned this on a Snowden morning last winter, when the walk had been shoveled again before dawn, and this time the shoveler had not driven away. Grant was sitting in his car at the curb, and when I opened the door he came up the path holding, with 2 hands, the way you hold something that outranks you, an envelope, soft with handling, and he said, Ed, I've been coming here trying to give you this for a month and losing my nerve, and I think you need to see it because I've had it the whole time, and that's part of my sentence too. It was June's hand on the envelope. 4 years he had kept it. And standing in my doorway in the cold, at his insistence, I read my wife's last letter to her son-in-law, and with Claire's permission and his, I am going to give you the 2 sentences from it that matter, because they are the reason this section exists. After the love, and there was love in it, real love, June wrote this. Grant, honey, you have the strongest need to be needed of any man I ever met, and I say this while I still can. Being needed and being good are not the same thing, and when Edwin's fires run out, and they will, promise me you won't light any just to keep your helmet on. She saw it. 4 years ahead, 10 weeks from her own death, dictating to me, and I never registered the sentence I was writing. My hand transcribed a prophecy addressed to the exact catastrophe, and I mailed it myself from the box on Sycamore. Grant stood on my doorstep with the snow coming down and said, I read it the week after the funeral, Ed, and I put it in a drawer. And every single time I drove to your mailbox at 6 in the morning, I knew that letter was in my house, knowing what I was. She wrote me the check, and I never once ran the math. And I stood there holding my wife's handwriting, and I will tell you what I felt, and it was not fresh rage. We were past rage by then. It was awe, the particular awe her diagram in the hallway had been teaching me for 40 years. Paper is testimony, she had testified. The letter had traveled, it had counted, it had been, like every real letter, a promise with a stamp on it, and the promise had been broken by its recipient. And now, 4 years late, it had completed delivery anyway at my door in the snow, in the hands of the man it had tried to save. I made him coffee. It seemed like what she was asking. We drank it mostly in silence at the kitchen table, the site of every crime and every verdict in this story. And when he left, I filed June's letter where it belonged, in the specimen drawer, the folder of known genuine articles, the reference library against which all arriving things are checked, because, friends, that is exactly what it is. The realest piece of mail I ever handled. Everything else gets held up against it. If this story has earned it from you, this is the moment I will ask, the only time tonight. Subscribe and put the word specimen in the comments if you intend to start the drawer, because what comes next is the part of my life these videos exist to fund and to feed, and I would like you there for it. Mail Mondays started the following spring, in the community room of the Birchwood Senior Center, third Monday of every month. Coffee urn, folding chairs, and a retired postal inspector with a corkboard. And yes, it is the same corkboard. It came back down from the attic for a better purpose. And it now displays, instead of my 41 letters, a rotating museum of counterfeits my students bring me. Because they bring them now, that is the whole victory. They bring them in purses and coat pockets, unopened, unanswered, uncalled, and we examine them together under the document camera Marisol's office donated, and the room learns to look where the letter is cheap. I open every session the same way. I hold up 2 envelopes, one real, one forged, and I tell the room one of these is lying, and neither of them is going to confess. And then I teach the checks, the callback rule, the urgency test, the secrecy test, the specimen drawer, the pattern ledger. And around the second hour, somebody always goes quiet in the particular way and stays after the folding chairs are stacked, holding a letter or just holding a suspicion, and that after-class conversation, friends. That is the actual work. The seminar is bait. The staying after is the catch. I will give you one from this winter with her blessing. A widow named Dorothea, 81, sharp as a hatpin, stayed after with nothing in her hands and said, "Inspector, I don't have a letter, I have a feeling, and I taught you people never to apologize for the feeling, so." Her grandson, she said, or a voice like him, had called twice from trouble in another state, and paper had followed, official, urgent paper about bond and fees, and something she said was off in the voice, close but off, like a photograph of a photograph. We ran the checks together at the folding table. The callback rule found her actual grandson at his actual number, at work, in no trouble whatsoever. The paper failed 3 of the 5 tests in as many minutes, and the barcode, Dorothea insisted on the barcode. She had heard about the barcode, did not some. $14,000, staged in an envelope in her hall drawer for a courier who was due Thursday, went back into her account Friday morning, and Marisol's office took the rest of it from there, and it went where such files deserve to go. Dorothea comes to every session now and sits in the front row and heckles me gently when I fumble the document camera, and last month she brought her bridge club, all 4 tables of it, and as they filed in she announced to the room, in the voice of an 81-year-old who has faced down a courier scheme and a hip replacement in the same year, "Ladies, pay attention. This man is going to teach you arithmetic that bites. Finest introduction of my career. I opened with the check digit in her honor, and one morning this past fall, the circle closed all the way in a lecture hall in Cleveland when Inspector Marisol Vega, who now teaches the fraud documents block she once sat through, called her old instructor out of retirement for a guest hour. The case study on the screen was anonymized. A retired subject matter expert, systematically defrauded through counterfeit correspondence by a trusted family member, and I stood at the front of that room, 13 years after I last stood in one, and watched 40 young inspectors work my own file without knowing whose it was, watched them find the check digits, the ghost facility, the 72-hour answering pattern, watched one trainee in the third row raise her hand and say, "The part I can't get past is the victim's background. How does this happen to someone who knows everything on this slide?" And Marisol looked at me one flicker and said, "Inspector Mercer, would you take that one?" And I told them the victim was flooded, not fooled. I told them about sieges and arithmetic, about vanity and lighthouses and wrecks, about how expertise is a wall and grief is a ladder. And the room got very quiet, the way rooms do when they realize the case study is standing at the lectern. And at the end, a young man stayed after, the way a young woman named Vega once stayed after, and asked me to teach him the check digit trick. And I did at the corner of the stage, digit by digit. And walking to my truck across that parking lot afterward I want the record to show, entirely unable to see the lot clearly, and it was not my eyes. My eyes are fine. My eyes, as this entire story establishes, are the one thing about me that never once stopped working. So here is where it all stands, on the evening I am recording this. The house on Chestnut Street is mine, deed untroubled, roof replaced, by a contractor I found myself, whose estimate I verified myself, an ordinary transaction that felt, after everything, like an act of athletics. The retirement account sits where it always sat, whole, boring, load-bearing. Claire has her own apartment 10 minutes away and a marriage in honest, uncertain repair, and a standing Sunday chair at my table, and a note card habit that has put, at last count, 61 pieces of real mail through her mother's blue box, every one of which checked. Vern comes Thursdays and loses at cribbage, and disputes the arithmetic, which from a document man is pure comedy. And last Thursday he arrived with a gift, wrapped in craft paper and string like something out of 1962, and inside was a brass magnifying loupe, engraved around the rim, and the engraving reads, "Look where it's boring," and it sits now on the kitchen windowsill, aimed at the mailbox, which Vern insists is a coincidence of feng shui, and I insist is the finest piece of installation art in Toledo. Bud watches the street, deputized for life. Marisol holds the seal, which has never needed breaking, and Grant Keller pays on schedule, shovels in the dark, and carries in some drawer of himself a letter from a woman who saw him whole and loved him anyway and asked him to be good. And whether he finally becomes the man that letter was mailed to is the one file in this whole affair that remains, honestly, open. I hope it closes well. June invested in it. If there is one thing I want you to take from tonight, out of all the checks and all the yarn, it is this. The counterfeit in your life, whatever envelope it arrives in, a letter, a sermon, a savior, a voice on a phone, is perfect exactly where you look and cheap exactly where you don't. And so the whole discipline of protecting yourself and everyone you love comes down to 4 words my wife could have told you in 1975 for free. Look where it's boring. The bar. The pattern, not the emergency. The filter rules, not the friendly interface. The man's arithmetic, not the man's warmth. Fear will always grab your eyes and drag them to the headline. Train your eyes every time to finish at the bottom of the page where the dull marks live, because the dull marks are where the truth and the lie are forced to differ, and everything above them is just performance. And the second thing, the June thing, keep paper. Write your days, file your letters, keep the specimen drawer, mail the real card to the real person with the real stamp. Not because paper is old, but because paper is testimony, a promise that agrees in advance to be held to. And a life that keeps testimony is a life that cannot be quietly rewritten by whoever controls the screens and the filters and the phone lines around it. They can counterfeit almost everything now: friends, voices, letters, urgency, even love's daily. What they cannot counterfeit is your own dated handwriting about your own days, sitting in a drawer, patient as Vern, waiting to some. Days lie. Fear lies faster. Paper doesn't. If this story reached you, tell me in the comments. Go back to the guess you made at the beginning, and to the moment you swore you would have caught it, and grade yourself honestly. And if the word climate found you earlier, or the word specimen is going on a folder in your house this week, say so, because every word in that comment section is a porch light for the next family reading in the dark. If someone you love gets mail that frightens them and someone always fixes it, send them this story gently, the way you would hand them a magnifying glass, not a verdict. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe so you do not miss what I have to share next. Thank you for staying with me until the end, all the way to the bottom of the page where the dull marks live. Trust the people you love. Verify the paper anyway. Call the number you already had. And if a letter ever arrives that makes your chest go tight at 2 in the morning, do what an old inspector finally did. Put your hand flat on the table, breathe once, and check the arithmetic. Because fear can counterfeit nearly anything in this world. But it has never once, in the entire history of the mail, gotten the math right. A final note before you go. Certain names, locations, and identifying details in this story have been altered to protect the privacy of everyone involved. If you or someone you know may be the target of mail fraud, counterfeit official correspondence, or financial exploitation, particularly involving an elderly family member, please contact the United States Postal Inspection Service, your local Adult Protective Services agency, or a qualified attorney directly. Report it even if it feels small and even if it feels shameful. It is neither.